Now I'm going to talk about it's all about changing your behavior. So before we dive deeper into changing your behavior, let's define what is behavior. Behavior is basically a response to a stimuli where individual reacts to some stimulus or a situation, and that is called behavior. Let's say in terms of digital world, let's say there's a promotion that is stimulus, and then the user reacts to the stimulus by clicking through the email link to buy a product. That's a behavior. So stimulus and the reaction. That two components make a behavior. In the technology world, there's a huge obsession or implicit obsession to change human behavior so that users are more loyal to their web product, either in terms of like a higher purchase or a longer retention. These kind of things help a web product to make more money. So there's a huge focus on behavior change in the technology industry. But the caveat is that among these behavior changes, the behavior is often small, such as making small purchases or staying a bit longer in a web product. Changes are really small. Nevertheless, this is a huge step forward from a human history perspective. Never before we have been able to study such a rigorous way the multiple facets of a human behavior with the precision of a click stroke. Now let's talk about is it true behavior change? Whether it is nudging behavior is a true behavior change. Let's talk about that for a second. Now let's say in an organ donation issue, people are afraid to donate organ. Organ donation rate is really low because they fear of organ harvesting. Let's say, for example, now in places where people must opt out of organ donation, the people who choose to opt out are very low. This makes the rate of organ donation very high in those places. And this is what the economist Richard Thaler called the power of a nudge. And if we apply this to a web product domain, then we see that lots of companies allow user to opt out of data sharing. So that means users have to manually click somewhere to opt out of data sharing. And this makes rates of data sharing very high. Now, this research into the human behavior or nudging to change the human behavior creates two distinct group of people who are indifferent to nudges and people who react negatively to nudging. But fortunately, data science allows us to identify these two group of people and treat them accordingly. We know that in digital world, when designing web product, we have to design such a way that people are more sticking with the web product. So nudging is important behavior. Nudging is important part of designing a web product. So when designing web product, the user has to be nudged who are indifferent to nudging, such a way that they stay longer or do a desired behavior within the web product. And later, we have to modify the web product in such a way that it persuades user who would not like to be nudged in such a way that it allows them different paths of behavior to mitigate negative consequences of nudging. Thirdly, now let's talk about quitting smoking, the Herculean task of behavioral change. We just talked about nudging, which is a short-term behavior change, and it can be easily achieved. But can we do the same thing with substantial, substantiative, life-changing behavior changes? Let's take example of alcohol addiction. Can we do that in that area? What we find is that quitting smoking is really hard to do in real life. People who try to quit without help of any medication do that around 2 to 6%, and people who get the help of medication, they do that around 25% for a period of 6 months of time. So why quitting behavior is so difficult? It is difficult because it is a human behavior change. It requires lots of factors to come together for a person to quit. For example, personal motivation to quit, social support, medication, etc. From our analysis, we find that social support and environment plays a huge role for a person to quit smoking. People who have social support, in addition to medication, quit around 50 to 60%, 50 to 75% of the time. So now we know that for major behavior change to occur, internal motivation and social support is really important. If we apply this concept to the domain of web product, we see that for major behavior change among users to occur, the social component in a website is really important. And this can be provided by web communities and social support inside a website where we are doing our business. And lastly, measuring behavior change. Behavior change can be measured by using techniques from applied behavior analysis, which focuses on behavioral modification for socially aberrant behaviors. As we already discussed, behavior is a response to a stimuli. So, the response to a stimuli can be modified by a process called conditioning. Usually, there are two types of behavioral conditioning: operant conditioning. So, this is basically a voluntary response to external stimuli, a voluntary response to consequences. And these consequences can be a positive or negative consequences. So, what we are saying here is that there's a stimuli, there's a behavior, and there's a consequence that follows behavior. And people change the behavior not only based upon stimuli, but change on the that comes after a behavior. That is the consequences. And second is the classical conditioning. It is a subconscious response to sensitive stimuli. A good example is a Pavlov's dog, where the Pavlov always rings a. In this experiment, the Pavlov scientist always rang a bell when he fed a dog. So as time went by, whenever bell rang, dog starts salivating, listening to a stimuli of the bell, even though the food was not present. So this is called classical conditioning. Now we have to identify the core elements of behavior, define them, and figure out how to measure them. Let's take example of the purchasing behavior. The first, the first, the first criteria of purchasing behavior is the user goes through the full user funnel for purchasing. Second, the user pays for the purchase. And thirdly, the user does not return the item within 10 days. Once this all criteria is satisfied, then we say that purchasing behavior has occurred. Now, we can measure this concept of behavior using different metrics or measures. First is repeatability. How often and extent, how often and extent of the change of behavior. How often the behavior occurs and extent of change of behavior. Count. Example of the metric, count. How many times the behavior occurs? Rate. How many times the behavior occurs within an hour or a minute? Rate of change. How does the rate change over time? Temporal extent. How long behavior lasts? Duration. The length of the behavior that has occurred. Temporal focus. Time in between behavior. Example of metric, response latency. So there's a treatment or there's a stimuli. How long does it take for behavior to start happening? Right? There's stimuli, and how long after that stimuli does behavior start occurs? Into response. How long does it take for behavior to repeat? Or the amount of time between two behaviors. Derivative measures, other measures, trials of criterion. How many time, how many trials does it take for a person to learn a behavior? And how does that interaction with other behavior? How does this behavior correlate to other behavior? Is a positive correlation or negative correlation? So these are four categories of metrics that we can examine to identify different dimensions of behavior. These not only these metrics are useful in understanding the behavior, but also understanding a behavioral change. And the change can occur in any four dimensions. So I just talked about what is behavior and how we can change behavior.